Anthony Burns had not been looking for a new beginning. He was looking for distance. Distance from the bureaucratic inertia of the state environmental agency he had worked in for over 15 years, from the chain of pointless meetings that led nowhere, from politicians who liked the sound of green until it touched their wallets. He had spent the better part of his adult life studying soil systems, hydrology, and urban runoff management, and for all his credentials, the job had left him hollow. What finally broke him was a proposal to bulldoze a preserved wetland to build a golf course. His objections had been logged, recorded, and swiftly ignored. That same week, he filed for early resignation. A month later, he bought the old property just outside city limits, on the edge of a suburban development that thought of itself as upscale, but in truth was aging, brittle, and clinging to an image it could no longer afford. The lot had been sitting in foreclosure for nearly a year, an overgrown parcel of land with a single-story house barely held together by cedar paneling and memory. For Anthony, it was perfect. He didn't move in with fanfare or contractors or permits. Instead, he brought with him a battered truck, 6 bags of heirloom seeds, a dozen soil samples in plastic containers, and one stubborn belief that this time he would make something that answered to no one but the land itself. The house wasn't much, but the land, it had promise. The soil was mixed, loamy in some patches and mineral-rich near the base of the shallow slope. More interesting was the water flow. Natural runoff from a nearby wooded incline passed right under his property, and he could already envision how he might redirect it, harness it gently into a low-impact irrigation system. He never intended to build anything showy or even particularly noticeable. His plans were precise: terraced planting beds that followed the natural gradient of the land, buffer zones for native pollinators, a small greenhouse for controlled experiments with root depth variability under changing climate conditions. This wasn't a hobby garden, it was a living system, and it mattered to him. The neighborhood was quiet at first, cautiously curious. A few passing waves from middle-aged residents walking their dogs, a brief hello from a man in an immaculate lawn care uniform who asked if Anthony needed anyone to get that mess under control. He declined politely. His mess was deliberate. Each wild-looking patch of growth was part of a test, an observation. Every morning began with the same ritual: coffee just past dawn, a notebook, and a slow walk around the lot with a soil probe. By the 3rd week, some of the same faces that had waved stopped doing so. Cars slowed as they passed his driveway, not to greet, but to inspect. One morning, someone left a laminated flyer in his mailbox. It was from the Community Beautification Committee. It included a list of acceptable landscaping standards and a bolded paragraph about maintaining a cohesive visual identity. He folded the paper once, then again, and used it to line the bottom of a compost bucket. It wasn't that he disliked people. He simply didn't need to be liked by them. He didn't attend the monthly committee meetings, didn't join the seasonal cleanup day, didn't install the regulation approved design mailbox. And yet, Anthony was not hostile. He waved when waved to. He returned misdelivered packages. He once helped an elderly neighbor re-level her raised bed garden after a storm. Still, his yard was viewed as a provocation, not a project. The plants he chose were not ornamental. They served functions: soil restoration, nitrogen fixation, drought resistance. His pathways weren't straight stone borders but mulch trails cut to minimize soil compaction. To most of the development's residents, it looked like a man letting the land run wild. It was at the 6-week mark that Karen appeared. Not as a stranger, but as something more dangerous. A self-declared guardian of community standards. She was large in presence, posture, and voice, the kind of person whose steps had rhythm even when she wasn't moving. Her front yard was a pristine geometry of boxwoods, solar-powered uplights, and flower beds selected for their color coordination rather than climate adaptability. Her voice was not unkind, not at first. She smiled widely, called him neighbor, and gestured at his land with a practiced laugh. We've never had someone quite so expressive with their planting before. Anthony nodded, said he was running soil analysis trials. She chuckled again, falsely, and asked whether he had reviewed the community design manual. We do have certain visual guidelines to maintain property value cohesion, she said, then added, just so there are no misunderstandings down the line. He didn't answer immediately, which she took as uncertainty. He looked toward the trellis he had constructed from repurposed bamboo, already supporting a climbing vine that would fix nitrogen in a few weeks. The value I'm maintaining isn't visual, he replied. It's ecological. She didn't laugh at that one. The encounter would have ended there. Another neighborly misunderstanding, had it not been for the next morning. Anthony woke to check the lower tier of his planting beds and found that over 30 plants, mostly first-year natives and heritage herbs, were yellowing, curling, or outright dead. The soil was wet in patches where it shouldn't have been. The air smelled faintly chemical, not sharp like pesticide, but sterile, as if something had leached the life out of the ground. His first instinct wasn't panic. It was confirmation. He took samples, marked coordinates in his field notebook, and stored what remained in sealed bags. Later that afternoon, he contacted a former colleague at a private agricultural lab, requesting a rush tox screen on the soil. He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't call the police. He didn't post online. He documented. 2 days later, the lab results came back with a note. Significant traces of a commercial-grade herbicide not sold over the counter, typically used for post-construction clearing or invasive brush management. The concentration was too high for accidental drift. Someone had applied it deliberately, and recently. The implications weren't just personal. The chemical had likely seeped into the water table that connected several of the lots in the development. It wasn't just an attack on his project. It was an environmental violation. And still, Anthony didn't react publicly. He didn't storm over to Karen's door or demand explanations. Instead, he filed a formal inquiry with the local municipal environmental office, citing suspected contamination and requesting a preliminary assessment of shared groundwater channels. It was a bureaucratic move, not a dramatic one. But it would do what needed to be done. Trigger oversight, raise flags, and complicate any further covert interference. If someone wanted a quiet neighborhood war, they had chosen the wrong opponent. That night, as the irrigation timer clicked on and the faint sound of trickling water echoed from his customized sloped channels, Anthony sat on his back steps, sipped his drink, and listened. There was no sense of triumph, no need for retribution. Not yet. There was only resolve, and the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been underestimated. 3 days after Anthony submitted the contamination inquiry, he received a thin envelope from the Office of Environmental Resource Oversight. It wasn't alarming, not in tone, but it carried the quiet implication of consequence. The letter confirmed receipt of his claim, included a reference number, and informed him that a preliminary investigation would be scheduled within a 6-week window, depending on staff availability. It wasn't fast, but it was in motion. In the meantime, he was advised to maintain a log of observations and avoid interfering with potential contaminated sites. Anthony took the note for what it was: a procedural stall disguised as progress. Still, a case number meant paperwork. And paperwork, especially the kind tied to environmental liability, had weight in neighborhoods that depended on appearance more than substance. While he waited, he began to rebuild. The destroyed beds were cleared and remulched. He didn't replant immediately. Instead, he installed a set of ground-level moisture sensors and additional timers for irrigation. At the edge of his lot, just beyond the formal survey markers, he dug a shallow channel to divert oversaturation runoff, discreetly lined with porous stone and a slow-drip filtration system. Nothing illegal, nothing even noteworthy to the casual observer, but enough to reroute water in a way that gave him control. His back gate was now padlocked. The only entrance was visible from his kitchen window, and a sensor-triggered light had been installed above the path. He wasn't trying to turn his garden into a fortress. He was making it proofed, resistant not just to nature but to interference. It wasn't long before Karen reappeared, not with chemicals, not with threats. This time she came with a clipboard and 2 other residents. One of them a tall man who Anthony vaguely recognized from earlier lawn mowing patrols. The other a woman who had previously ignored his greetings. They approached mid-morning, standing just outside his lot line as if testing for signs of welcome. Karen's voice was bright and polished, but her words were barbed. She said she was organizing a community compliance walkthrough, a periodic assessment of property maintenance, aesthetics, and shared responsibilities. It was, she said, an opportunity for dialogue. She suggested they start with his yard. Anthony declined, politely but firmly, and added that his property was undergoing environmental review and thus should not be disturbed. Karen blinked as if the phrase, environmental review, had pierced something under her skin. The man beside her said nothing. The other woman made a mark on her clipboard. The next morning, Anthony found a note taped to his front door, unsigned but printed on official letterhead. It stated that his drainage work constituted an unauthorized landscape modification that may impact community hydrological infrastructure. The wording was vague enough to mean anything and technical enough to sound valid. He recognized the tactic, bureaucratic fog. He called the number on the notice and was transferred twice before a voicemail recording informed him that he could submit a written request for clarification. Instead, he filed a secondary notice with the Environmental Oversight Office, now citing possible obstruction of assessment access by community actors. He wasn't reacting. He was recording. By the end of the week, the conflict had slipped from passive to active. Someone had repositioned his front property marker. Not far, only a few inches, but enough to suggest boundary tampering. The stake was still in the ground, but the orientation had changed. Its tag turned inward. Anthony, aware that proving this kind of move was nearly impossible, didn't touch it. He took photographs, logged the coordinates, and sent the images to a surveyor friend who had helped him validate the lot dimensions during purchase. The reply came the next day. Minor, but deliberate. You're being tested. The following evening, his water pressure dropped inexplicably. It wasn't catastrophic, but his rear irrigation zone failed to trigger, and the pressure readout from the sensor system showed erratic dips during scheduled watering. He checked the municipal line. It was stable. He traced his own system. Somewhere between the main valve and the secondary timer box, the flow was being throttled. When he opened the utility panel near the side fence, he discovered that the pressure regulator had been tampered with. Not damaged, just adjusted, as if someone had opened it, nudged the setting down, and resealed it. The lock had no signs of breakage, but the metal felt out of alignment, the threads slightly off. Someone had used their own tool, not his. He didn't tell anyone. He replaced the regulator, this time adding a concealed pressure spike sensor that would log all future adjustments. And then, for the first time, he made a deliberate choice not just to record, but to respond. Not with confrontation, with design. His irrigation system, already modular and distributed, had a zone that ran along the east side of his property, sloping downward toward Karen's lot. It had been installed to redirect overflow into a catchment basin designed for soil recharge. That night, he revised the flow configuration. The system would continue to function as intended. Water would go where it was needed, timed to the soil's thirst. But if the east channel reached saturation, it would trigger a release valve. Not a flood, not sabotage. A regulated, persistent overspill calibrated to pressure and gravity. Every night at 3:10 a.m., the system would cycle. If the slope was wet, water would flow down the incline, hugging the edge of his property and bleed into the area behind Karen's decorative hedge wall. It was not enough to damage. It was enough to stain. Within 3 days, the signs appeared. The lower edge of the Karen's stucco wall showed dark discoloration. Not visible from the street, but obvious from her garden path. Her solar lights had shorted, and a segment of mulch near her irrigation box had turned to slurry. Anthony said nothing. He merely reset the timers to randomize the nightly interval. The logic was simple. If she watched at 3:10, nothing would happen. But eventually, when she stopped watching, it would begin again. On the 4th morning, she came to his door, this time alone. Her knock was harder. When he opened the door, she wasted no time. She accused him of intentional property damage, of manipulating runoff, of creating a hostile drainage environment. Anthony listened, said nothing for a while, then invited her to inspect his property, under 2 conditions. First, she must bring a certified assessor. Second, any claim she made had to be filed through the same environmental oversight channel he was using. She hesitated, then scoffed. "You think you're smarter than everyone else," she said. "No," he replied. "I just prefer systems to shouting." Later that day, he received another letter. This one was longer, filled with legalese and sent from a community legal representative. It outlined a series of claims: non-compliant irrigation, disturbance of visual continuity, encroachment through passive runoff, and potential liability for depreciation. It was, in every sense, a threat wrapped in ordinance. Anthony read it once, set it down, and drafted his reply. A 12-page dossier with diagrams, timestamps, system logs, and environmental approvals, cross-referenced to municipal records and embedded with notations from 2 independent consultants. He didn't send it to Karen. He sent it to the environmental office with a carbon copy to the city's public green space department. Then he went outside and turned on the hose manually, not to water, but to clean the pressure sensors. That night, the east valve tripped open exactly at 3:37 a.m. The water flowed down, silent and slow, blending with the night's dew. Anthony didn't watch. He already knew the system worked. He had built it that way. The tension, once subtle and buried beneath pleasantries and bureaucratic notices, now began to calcify into something visible, something almost tactile. The atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted. Conversations paused when Anthony passed, curtains moved when he opened his gate, and cars drove just a little slower past his house. There was no single event that flipped the switch, but a slow accretion of friction, the way powder collects before it flashes. The so-called community had never embraced his presence, but now it began to resist it, not with dialogue or confrontation, but with a coordinated, procedural suffocation that wore the mask of civic order. It started with a letter, just like so many others, this one from the Regional Water Board citing a pending inspection due to a concerned referral regarding unauthorized hydrological activity on his property. The language was vague but pointed, carefully composed to sound neutral while implying guilt. Anthony responded with precision, submitting a document packet that included diagrams of his irrigation layout, signed statements from his environmental consultant, flow rate records, and soil infiltration test results. He didn't argue. He documented. And he waited. Soon after, he noticed something off with the eastern planter bed. The soil was drier than it should have been given the automated cycle from the night before, and when he checked the irrigation valve, the system showed inconsistent pressure levels. He examined the timer enclosure and found that the secondary flow regulator had been opened and manually turned down, then hastily resealed. There were no signs of forced entry, just misalignment in the casing screws and faint residue on the dial, as if someone with greasy fingers had adjusted it in a hurry. The system hadn't failed. It had been tampered with. He didn't tell anyone. Instead, he replaced the regulator and added a secondary sensor, a passive weight detection plate, the kind used in field research to track animal movement. It wouldn't record images. It wouldn't raise alarms. It would just collect presence, weight, pressure, duration, data. That was what mattered. It didn't take long for that data to return something useful. The logs showed a presence large enough to be human, short enough in duration to suggest familiarity with the layout, and consistent with someone stepping into the bed, adjusting something, and leaving quickly. He didn't speculate. He added the findings to his private archive. Meanwhile, the damage to his plants became more precise. It was no longer the random death of seedlings or surface scorch marks from chemical runoff. Now, entire clusters were wilting overnight, and soil samples revealed localized changes in acidity inconsistent with natural fluctuations. It was surgical sabotage, targeted, deliberate, and increasingly emboldened. He adjusted the response. The east drainage line, which previously funneled overflow gently down the grade into a slow-absorbing catchment basin, was reconfigured, not to flood, but to saturate. A small variation in angle, a recalibration of output volume, and a shift in scheduling meant that the runoff would now trickle closer to the boundary with Karen's yard. It was still within code, still within his legal right, but it introduced variables. It introduced inconvenience. He made no announcement, no threats, just a system that now responded to interference with complexity instead of silence. The next visible reaction came not from Karen, but from the neighborhood. 2 members of her committee arrived uninvited, clipboards in hand, under the pretense of assessing shared aesthetic impact. Anthony met them at the edge of his property, said nothing, and handed them a copy of his project registration, stamped and dated by the city's own Environmental Development Department. He did not let them in. He didn't have to. They left with tight jaws and few words. The following morning, someone had moved one of his survey markers by 6 inches. Not removed, just twisted, just enough to suggest shifting ground, to imply uncertainty about the exact boundaries of his rights. It was petty, but petty things accumulate. Still, he made no public response. Instead, he scheduled a formal reassessment with the survey firm that had initially certified his perimeter. Quietly, methodically, he reinforced the legal footprint of his work. When the city's soil monitoring team arrived to begin the assessment he'd triggered weeks ago, he provided them with coffee, clean maps, and unimpeded access. Karen attempted to intervene, demanding to know what authority allowed this intrusion. The lead technician politely pointed to her lot number on the included assessment corridor. She tried to protest, but found no traction. They weren't interested in neighborhood politics. They were there to test the earth. She retaliated the only way she knew how: direct sabotage. One evening, Anthony returned from a supply run to find a smear of paint across the lowest part of his eastern wall. Not enough to be called vandalism by legal standards. Just enough to stain, to mark. No signature, no note, just a crude, wet reminder. He didn't clean it, he logged it. Then he adjusted the irrigation timer again, not to respond in anger, but to increase precision. Now, the east zone would run longer, and at staggered intervals, never the same pattern twice. The effect was gentle, invisible to the casual observer, but the soil near her garden edge began to soften to hold water longer. Her decorative path grew darker. Her lowest flower bed developed a mold patch. Her solar lights began to flicker. When a city inspector came to review her complaint about water intrusion, he found nothing actionable. He recommended she consult a private landscaper. She accused him of being compromised. He left without arguing. That night, Anthony expanded the capacity of his overflow basin, not to store more, but to slow the release. His system now reacted in real time to soil saturation, adjusting flow rates dynamically based on the conditions at the border. He didn't need to watch it work. He already knew it would. By now, Karen had lost her composure. Her usual tactic, procedural pressure, weaponized regulations, performance authority, no longer yielded results. Anthony wasn't playing the same game. He didn't push back emotionally. He applied leverage structurally. Her allies within the neighborhood began to falter. They stopped showing up to her weekly check-ins. Some of them, the quieter ones, even nodded at Anthony when they passed. He didn't return the gesture. He didn't need their approval. He had the advantage, and more importantly, he had the patience. The final ripple of this phase came not in an attack, but in silence. For days, there were no more visits, no more letters, no new complaints. Anthony used the time to refine his systems further. He tested new percolation rates, introduced biodegradable flow regulators, updated his logs. His property became an ecosystem, not just of plants, but of response. A terrain that could not be bullied or overwhelmed, only outsmarted. Karen, for all her aggression, was learning what that meant. Her attempts to dominate through proximity, through force, through pressure, were now being answered not with confrontation, but with saturation. Anthony had stopped defending his land. He had made it its own defense, and the ground, once neutral, now spoke for him. The equilibrium that had formed, Anthony's systems quietly adjusting to Karen's provocations, Karen retreating into a frustrated silence, was not built to last. It was too volatile, too dependent on one side remaining patient while the other seethed in powerlessness. That balance broke the moment outside attention began to seep into the edges of their private war. It wasn't media, it wasn't neighbors gossiping. It was institutional awareness, the slow-turning machinery of municipal interest that began to recognize something unusual about a single residential lot triggering such persistent procedural friction. The early site assessments conducted by the Environmental Office had produced unremarkable conclusions. Anthony's systems were compliant, the surrounding hydrology undisturbed. But what caught the attention of one city planner wasn't damage or violation, but the sophistication of what he'd built. They weren't accustomed to seeing adaptive irrigation tied into responsive drainage on a single-person residence. Someone flagged the report. It was forwarded. It landed on the desk of an assistant director in the Urban Sustainability Pilot Division. The file was thin but interesting. Soon, Anthony received a visit from two individuals who introduced themselves as observers from the city's Experimental Infrastructure Initiative. They said little, asked if they could walk the property, and took quiet notes as he explained his water regulation design, his soil resilience work, and the logic behind redirecting passive runoff into tiered biofiltration cells. He expected skepticism or condescension, but instead, one of them asked for permission to return with an analyst. Not a supervisor, not an enforcer, a scientist. Anthony agreed. He didn't sense an ambush. He sensed something far more dangerous to Karen: legitimacy. The following week, a clean, unmarked white car parked across the street, and a woman in field boots and a windbreaker stepped out. She was direct, curious, asked few personal questions but many about flow, pressure, capacity, and resilience. Anthony walked her through everything without embellishment. She listened, took measurements, and stood for a long time near the eastern slope, where the edge of his system met the property line with Karen's. She didn't mention the tension. She didn't need to. The ground spoke for itself. When she left, she said only, "If what you've built is working, we might want to learn from it." Karen must have seen the visit. The next morning, Anthony found 2 city workers on his street examining utility markings. When asked, they said they'd been called for a permit validation survey related to an infrastructure complaint. Anthony didn't challenge them. He returned inside, opened his records, and sent a courtesy message to the Sustainability Division informing them that a validation team had arrived without notification. An hour later, the workers were gone. No permit had been filed. No complaint existed on record. It was a bluff. And someone in the city had shut it down. That marked the turning point. Karen, sensing her grip weakening, abandoned all pretense of procedure and reverted to interference. That night, Anthony discovered one of his low-flow outlets had been physically blocked, plugged with mulch and yard debris, jammed deep enough to back water up into the channel and cause surface pooling. It wasn't subtle. It was an act of desperation. He cleared the obstruction carefully, collected samples from the debris, and submitted them to the city technician who had previously visited. It wasn't about punishment. It was about showing the system that the system itself was being gamed. 3 days later, Anthony was asked to speak briefly at an informal roundtable for urban adaptive landscaping, a small event hosted by the Sustainability Division, with no media and no public announcement. The request wasn't public, but Karen found out. She arrived at his property that afternoon with a clipboard and a forced smile. She claimed she was checking in on community harmony and wanted to bury the tension. He asked her plainly if she had obstructed his outflow channel. She blinked, eyes narrowing. "You're not the victim here," she said. "You're manipulating everything." Anthony responded with a single question. "Are you here in an official capacity?" She hesitated, said nothing, and walked away. Her next move was personal. A letter arrived from a private law firm, addressed in ornate script, threatening to file for damages due to persistent environmental encroachment, psychological distress, and aesthetic devaluation. The letter was flimsy. No evidence, no enforceable complaint, but Anthony forwarded it to his environmental lawyer, who sent back a 3-sentence dismissal and included copies of every regulatory approval tied to his project. They didn't hear back from the firm. By this point, Karen's facade within the neighborhood had begun to crack. Residents who had once backed her initiatives now stepped around her at committee meetings. She had become unpredictable, erratic, issuing violations for trash bins positioned incorrectly or for driveways she deemed unwashed. Several homeowners quietly approached Anthony not to apologize, but to ask if he could share the name of his irrigation consultant. He gave them contact details without commentary. The irony was not lost on him. The soil near Karen's eastern retaining wall began to shift. Not collapse, shift. Moisture retention increased subtly, enough to affect the density gradient but not enough to justify a formal claim. Anthony noted it. He didn't exploit it. But his system, which responded to saturation and adjusted its timing to reduce unnecessary overflow, began to cycle more frequently on that side, not because he ordered it to, but because her blockage had disrupted the soil's absorption rate. The system wasn't attacking. It was adapting, and adaptation in a closed environment always caused stress to the rigid. Karen, ever more agitated, filed a final grievance with the neighborhood council demanding that Anthony's system be dismantled pending full legal review. The council declined, citing lack of jurisdiction and the ongoing partnership with the city's environmental division. That refusal devastated her. Her authority, once unquestioned, had been officially bypassed. She had been reduced to noise. Anthony, having anticipated this final collapse of opposition, began preparing the next phase of his project, converting the lower bed into a native plant nursery for drought-resistant species. He filed the paperwork, received a quiet thumbs-up from the city, and moved forward without fanfare. His system continued its work. Silent, steady, unapologetic, and the ground, once disrupted, began to regenerate. The war had never been loud. It had never been about shouting matches or police reports or viral videos. It had been a contest of control, of intelligence, of resilience. And as Karen withdrew behind her hedges and her increasingly isolated accusations, Anthony didn't celebrate. He simply documented. Because victory, for him, was never about winning. It was about creating something that couldn't be undone. Whatever restraint Karen had been clinging to dissolved the moment she realized that Anthony's position in the neighborhood was no longer marginal. His inclusion in the city's sustainability pilot, however quiet and bureaucratic, had shifted perception. Where once he had been tolerated as an eccentric outsider, now he was seen, by some at least, as an innovator. Worse, he was becoming an example. Others had started asking questions about water-efficient design, about zoning limits and landscape exemptions. He hadn't tried to convert anyone, hadn't handed out flyers or pitched workshops, but the visibility of what he'd built made a kind of statement she couldn't control, and that loss of control transformed her behavior into something openly hostile. She no longer pretended to care about regulations or procedural formality. She treated Anthony's presence as a violation in itself. Her campaign escalated from passive sabotage to something bolder, riskier, and far less careful. One morning, Anthony stepped outside to find the lower eastern quadrant of his property disrupted. Not vandalized in the crude sense, nothing slashed, burned, or painted, but violated. The carefully contoured bed had been trampled. The moisture sensors were ripped from the ground and thrown aside. One had been crushed under what looked like a garden tool. A narrow trench had been dug near the perimeter where the groundwater buffer zone transitioned into the slow-release path. It was shallow, unprofessional, likely done in a hurry. The implication was obvious. Someone had tried to locate and damage the pipe infrastructure. It wasn't an act of protest. It was an attempt to cripple the system from the root. Anthony stood over the scene not with shock but with a kind of cold, technical fury. He didn't clean it. He didn't touch anything. He took photographs, captured the GPS data from the sensor's last readings, and filed a formal complaint to the Environmental Division, not as a homeowner, but as the steward of a recognized urban test bed, now under observation for adaptive infrastructure modeling. The response was swift. A city representative arrived, not in uniform, but with authority. They inspected the site, took their own readings, and noted the absence of surveillance footage. When Anthony explained his decision not to install cameras, the representative didn't question it. They simply advised that a report would be filed, and that given the project's current status, further interference could trigger legal ramifications beyond community-level disputes. Anthony thanked them and went back inside. He knew what would happen next. Karen wouldn't back down. She would pivot. And she did. Within days, 2 different residents received anonymous complaints filed through the neighborhood liaison portal, accusing them of zoning violations and improper land use. One of them, a retired biology teacher who had recently converted a strip of lawn into a pollinator bed, was served a cease and desist notice regarding the introduction of potentially allergenic flora. Anthony knew immediately what it was. Proxy. Pressure. Karen was targeting the periphery, attempting to isolate him by intimidating anyone who might appear sympathetic to his approach. The goal was simple: to reassert dominance, not just over him, but over the possibility of others following his path. Anthony responded the only way he knew how. He escalated. Not with words, not with confrontation, but with infrastructure. He accelerated the second phase of his design. Where previously his system had been confined to controlled irrigation and passive runoff management, he now began integrating atmospheric response modules, sensors that could read ambient temperature, air humidity, and forecasted rainfall. adjusting water dispersal rates accordingly. The system wasn't merely reactive anymore, it was predictive. And he submitted the upgrade notice directly to the city with a technical addendum explaining its potential as a drought mitigation model. They replied with interest, and the upgrade was formally registered. Karen's reaction was a breakdown in strategy. That week, a flyer circulated through several driveways accusing Anthony of engineering unregulated water saturation intended to intimidate fellow residents. It was unsigned but printed on high-quality paper and clearly written by someone with experience in formal complaints. It failed to gain traction. Most neighbors ignored it. A few joked about it. But Karen doubled down. She began patrolling the sidewalk outside his home during early hours, documenting puddles with her phone, pointing them out to passers-by as if cataloging violations. Anthony watched once from behind his window as she knelt down, scooped up a handful of damp mulch from her side of the hedge, and sniffed it, then looked around as if waiting for applause. There was none. Then, during a particularly humid stretch, the first real failure occurred, not in his system, but on her property. The saturated edge of her eastern wall, long exposed to inconsistent drainage due to her refusal to install runoff breaks, began to swell. Not structurally, but cosmetically. The paint bubbled, the lower plaster layer discolored. A mold ring began to form just behind her garden lights. She tried to hide it with a wooden trellis, then covered that with climbing ivy that wilted within a week. Anthony didn't respond. He logged it. Her mistake wasn't the damage, it was reporting it. She filed a formal claim against him for property devaluation due to water encroachment. In doing so, she triggered an inspection, not just of his system, but of the entire corridor between their lots. The city assigned an outside consultant to avoid bias. The consultant walked the properties, reviewed the drainage maps, tested flow volumes, and examined topography. Their report was definitive. Anthony's system was not the cause. In fact, it had reduced ambient water load by over 20% during seasonal saturation compared to adjacent lots. Karen's damage was self-inflicted, an accumulation of poor maintenance, failure to install appropriate gutter systems, and multiple documented interferences with natural drainage patterns. The report wasn't made public, but it was sent to both of them. Anthony filed it away. Karen exploded. That night, his property was hit again. Not surgically, not with stealth. Someone threw soil laced with chemical fertilizer over his fence, directly into the upper planting bed. The smell was acrid, synthetic, unmistakable. He discovered it the next morning by scent alone. He ran a soil test on the spot. The pH was off the charts and early growth nodes showed signs of burn. He didn't report it. He documented it, then flushed the bed with gray water from his emergency reservoir, saturating the perimeter to isolate the contamination. The chemicals would leach slowly down the slope, just as her runoff had, all those weeks ago. Anthony didn't sleep that night. He drafted a complete system profile instead, detailing every structural element of his project, including the fail-safes, the countermeasures, the resilience patterns. He submitted the report not to the city, but to a regional architecture and planning symposium seeking real-world case studies on private ecological infrastructure. It was accepted, and he was invited to present. Karen, learning of the invitation through one of the planning committee's newsletters, lost whatever was left of her composure. She filed an appeal, not with the city, but with the symposium board, accusing Anthony of environmental fraud, citing neighbor testimony, and pending legal action. The board replied with formality. The claims were unsubstantiated. The project, documented and verified, the invitation unchanged. She had played every card, bent every lever she controlled, and found herself outside the game. Anthony, once the man she tried to push out through rules and fines and sabotage, had become a name in their regional discourse. A quiet one, perhaps, but not one easily erased. She didn't return to his fence again, but the mold on her wall continued to grow, and the water in the soil continued to rise, not from malice, but from response. Because by now, his land wasn't just reacting to her, it was correcting her. Karen had not disappeared. She had simply gone quiet in the way predators do when they are recalculating. After the symposium appearance, which Anthony delivered without flourish or attention-seeking, simply presenting his system as a living, evolving model of ecological self-regulation, she withdrew from visibility. She stopped patrolling the sidewalks, stopped issuing notices, stopped confronting city workers with hand-drawn diagrams of imaginary violations. But silence from her was never peace. It was a warning, a retreat into deeper, colder waters where fewer rules applied. And sure enough, one morning, Anthony discovered a shift so precise and so intimate it could only have come from someone who had studied his work not to understand it, but to wound it. One of his water regulation basins, an underground filtration node designed to manage overflow from seasonal high-intensity cycles, had been disturbed. The cover plate, buried beneath a mulch layer and secured by tamper-resistant bolts, had been unscrewed. The soil around it compacted by someone heavy enough to leave no trace but not careless enough to break the structure. It wasn't vandalism, it was inspection, and it suggested someone had either gained access to his technical drawings or had spent significant time reverse-engineering the surface patterns of his design. He resecured the plate, deepened the mulch, added a passive alert sensor that would trigger a silent flag in his system log if pressure was applied again. He didn't send a complaint. He made a backup, because he knew what was coming would not arrive through open channels. It began with a doorbell ring. Not loud, measured. A courier delivered a thick envelope, marked not with a firm's name, but a private arbitrator's office. Inside, a formal mediation demand. Karen had filed for binding third-party arbitration under a rarely used clause in the neighborhood's founding agreement, alleging long-term environmental disruption, psychological harassment via engineered water dispersal, and malicious topographical manipulation designed to induce emotional duress. It was absurd, but it was legal. And under that clause, if Anthony refused to participate, he could be declared non-compliant and stripped of certain development privileges, including ongoing access to his external expansion permit. The move was not about winning. It was about halting, about freezing his progress until she could wear him down. He had no intention of letting that happen. He accepted the arbitration. But he didn't arrive alone. He brought a full copy of every city-sanctioned document tied to his project. He brought the Sustainability Division's memo of support. He brought the consultant's soil reports, pressure readouts, water quality results, and neighborhood runoff maps showing systemic improvement since the inception of his system. And he brought a witness, a hydrologist from the city's Climate Impact Office who had independently reviewed his work for inclusion in a state-level adaptive landscaping initiative. Karen arrived with two people, a junior lawyer whose eyes rarely left his notes, and a private engineer who had not once set foot on Anthony's property. The arbitration room was quiet, sterile, the air heavy with a kind of sterile finality. For the first hour, Karen's team read aloud a litany of grievances: property loss, staining, aesthetic harm, stress-induced medical symptoms, a broken water timer on her own system she blamed on electromagnetic interference. None of it landed. None of it could be substantiated. Then Anthony responded. He did not speak emotionally. He walked through the design process, the environmental approvals, the way each stage had been reported, verified, and validated by neutral parties. When the arbitrator asked about the alleged psychological harassment, Anthony simply opened a folder of printed emails, most of them from Karen, filled with veiled threats, accusations, even explicit admissions of sabotage. He handed them over without comment. The arbitrator's expression didn't change, but the weight in the room shifted. At the end of the hearing, no decision was made. They were told it would be reviewed. But both parties could see it. Karen had lost the thread. She had walked into a battle of records, expecting it to be a war of perception, and discovered too late that Anthony's power wasn't in charm or eloquence. It was in precision. Her final attempt to control the outcome had backfired into exposure. That evening, as he returned home, Anthony found a single piece of paper taped to his gate. No signature, no header, just a handwritten phrase in block letters. "You've made this personal." He removed it without a word. The next phase was not official. It was not procedural. It was raw, physical retaliation. In the middle of the night, his eastern fence line caught fire. It was small, targeted, a single flare igniting the dry edge of a storage bed lined with old composting straw. The damage was minimal. The flames were caught quickly by a sensor-triggered microspray system he had installed months earlier as a precaution. But the message was clear, and this time, it wasn't about sabotage. It was about fear. Someone wanted him to know they could reach him, could bring flame to the boundary he had so meticulously maintained. He filed a police report, not because he believed it would be solved, but because it marked a line crossed. The investigation led nowhere. No witnesses, no footage, no follow-up. Anthony reinforced the perimeter with underground firebreak material and installed thermal response filament along the fence posts. He didn't sleep for 2 nights. Then something shifted. Not in Karen, but in the neighborhood. Someone anonymously forwarded a digital copy of the soil consultant's report to the community mailing list. No commentary, just the file. Residents read it. Some responded with silence, others with quiet nods when they passed Anthony's driveway. One, an older man who had previously ignored him, stopped to ask about the best time to install a rain collection system. Karen, meanwhile, locked her gate. The mold patch at the base of her house grew larger. The trellis hiding the wall began to sag. Her driveway, once pristine, now cracked in 2 places where roots had been mismanaged and no longer redirected. And her voice, once a constant presence in every corner of community life, was no longer heard. Anthony didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He continued his work. The irrigation system operated as planned, sensors adapting to weather, flow calibrated to season. The eastern slope, once the site of contention, now supported a lush line of drought-resistant shrubs designed to reinforce the border without draining the water table. He submitted one final report to the city, a proposal to open the system for observational study by local college students studying ecological engineering. It was approved without revision. What Karen had tried to kill had not only survived, it had evolved into something replicable, something beyond her reach. Her attempts to destroy Anthony's work, his credibility, even his resolve, had left her not only defeated, but irrelevant. The final confirmation came not in court, not through arbitration, but when her house was quietly listed for sale. No signs, no open house, just a line in the registry. Anthony saw it. He said nothing, because this, finally, was the system functioning as it should. Correction, without force. Order, without noise. Karen's departure was not dramatic. There were no moving trucks at dawn, no awkward goodbyes or final standoffs at the property line. One day, the curtains in her front windows were closed, and a few weeks later, they remained that way. A discreet real estate agent arrived in an unmarked sedan, took photos from the sidewalk, and left without knocking on any doors. The listing appeared online as a quiet exit opportunity, with potential for cosmetic updates. No mention was made of the mold damage or the soil drainage issues. Her name disappeared from the community committee roster without ceremony. No farewell message was sent to residents. The neighborhood, in its careful suburban way, erased her presence the same way it had once endorsed her authority, with indifference disguised as civility. Anthony didn't track her forwarding address, didn't ask where she went or why. He knew enough. Whatever had finally broken her resolve had not been a single moment of defeat, but the slow realization that her power, once unchecked and unquestioned, had become obsolete in the face of something she couldn't bully or outmaneuver. She had tried to bend a system built on adaptation and response, and in doing so, had revealed how rigid and fragile her own authority truly was. In the weeks that followed, a noticeable stillness settled over the neighborhood, not the silence of tension, but of neutrality. The passive surveillance stopped. Sidewalk conversations no longer lowered their volume as Anthony passed. A few residents began to initiate small talk. Nothing probing, just the kind of surface-level recognition that marks the soft beginnings of coexistence. He didn't trust it, but he didn't resist it either. He understood that change in places like this didn't come through confrontation or conversion, but through consistency. His yard remained unchanged in its principles, but the vegetation had matured. The eastern slope was now fully terraced, the shrubs anchoring the soil with visible health, and the runoff system blended so cleanly into the landscape that new passers-by mistook it for decorative landscaping. The neighborhood newsletter, once a passive-aggressive battleground for veiled complaints and community enforcement, published a short piece about innovative approaches to water conservation, citing his project without using his name. Anthony clipped the article, not for pride, but for records. It marked a shift, not in attention, but in tone. The city maintained occasional contact, forwarding updates on pilot program metrics and requesting anonymized data for internal reporting. He complied. A graduate student visited once asking permission to observe the system as part of her thesis on decentralized environmental control strategies. He agreed, walked her through the layers of logic embedded in the design, and answered her questions without embellishment. It wasn't a lecture, it was a handoff. What he had built was no longer an act of defense. It had become a framework, something teachable, something replicable, something that no longer needed to justify its existence through resistance. That transformation, more than any official recognition, was the real conclusion. The remnants of Karen's presence lingered in traces. An old community flyer in a gutter, a fading patch on the wall where her trellis had once stood, the discolored edge of the lawn she'd tried to weaponize through aesthetics. But they were just that, remnants. Her influence had evaporated not through conflict but through irrelevance, and the neighborhood, true to its nature, filled the vacuum not with apology, but with forgetfulness. No one mentioned the fire. No one asked about the arbitration outcome. The system corrected itself not through justice, but through absorption, swallowing tension into routine and leaving only the quiet utility of order behind. Anthony found no satisfaction in revenge, because revenge had never been the point. What mattered was that his work endured, that it functioned, that it expanded, that it proved itself not as an argument, but as an outcome. He continued his maintenance with the same steady hand, adjusting pressure valves, testing soil health, monitoring seasonal patterns. The garden responded, not with flourish, but with resilience. There was no final confrontation, no cinematic closure, just a season folding into the next, a house that held steady, and a system that no longer needed to resist because it had already won by surviving.